All right, this is a eligibility PowerPoint. It's a summary of the eligibility section of the handbook. You should read the handbook to get the details. This will just be a summary of the important issues. So the first slide here tells us the topics we're going to try and cover in this session. The first thing is key definitions. Very important to understand the definitions because everything throughout the handbook is built on the definitions of certain terms, and we'll cover the ones I think are the most significant. The first thing is the eligibility certification process. There are 4 to 5 forms that need to be completed for the eligibility of a student athlete. The first one is the eligibility certificate. The second is the certificate of clearance. The third is transfer eligibility statement if they are a transfer. Another form for a transfer may be a transfer verification depending on certain circumstances. And then in Division 1 only, there is an eligibility certificate for entering freshmen. Entering freshmen must be on both the eligibility certificate and the eligibility certificate for entering freshmen in Division 1. Here's a copy of the eligibility certificate. You notice that there's columns A through L. So we usually, when we refer to things when we're working through eligibility issues, we're going to talk about the columns. So it's important to know what each column represents. All right, so here are some of the key definitions. First of all is enrollment. A student enrolls when they complete the enrollment process for your institution. Each institution does that differently. Some do it online, some do it via paper. Doesn't matter how your institution does it. Once the student is enrolled, then they become identified, which is the third term on this slide. They must identify with you by enrolling in a total of 12 hours at your institution. An entering freshman is typically a high school graduate. Sometimes they take a year off or so and then become a freshman. So they're a freshman if they're a high school graduate and have not been enrolled full-time at a previous institution. The other thing I wanted to address is dual credit. So a lot of students are coming out of high school with college credit called dual credit. Those hours are great toward their overall degree, but they're not relevant toward any of the terms or anything else that we will be working through here. Next terms are institutional credit hour. So students sometimes take remedial classes or other classes that are not 100 or above. Those would not be institutional credit hours, so they must take institutional credit hour toward and post it on their transcript with a degree. When we talk about terms, there's two kinds of things to be aware of. A term is when someone is enrolled full-time in 12 hours. If they're enrolled in less than 12 hours, we call that a non-term. So that's a very important distinction. Column C on the eligibility certificate talks about terms of attendance. That would only be terms that were 12 hours or more. Another key term is normal progress. A student is expected to accumulate credit toward a degree to be eligible for athletics. Obviously, it's got to be 12 hours of term, and all those hours are going toward a degree. They can't be random hours. They have to be hours toward a degree. The next key term is prospective student. A prospective student is someone who's not been identified at another institution. So that could be a high school graduate. It could be someone who was at another school but is no longer enrolled at that previous school. That would be a prospective student. So you see their incoming freshman or a transfer not identified. They're identified, if you recall back in the previous slide, by enrolling in 12 hours, whether that's at your institution or another one. The last one is the season of competition. This is when they're charged a season. In our association, that's when they play in 20%. You see here on this slide, this is how we define seasons of competition. So it's 20% of the maximum allowable contest. So it's not 20% of how many games they play or how many games the school plays, but 20% of the maximum allowed contest. So the example we have here is basketball. Basketball is allowed 28 games. 20% of that is 6. So if they play in 6, they're not charged. If they play in 7, they're charged. The other key thing with this rule is that if they play one game in postseason play, even if they're under the 20%, they will be charged for that season. A couple other things here that are important to understand with seasons of competition is one is that this rule started in 2021. So anyone charged a season before that would be under the previous rule, which was playing 1 second of one game, you're charged an entire season. And anyone who goes to another school, another athletic association, they are charged based on that rule or that association. So in the NAI and the NCCAA, we both use the 20% rule. In the USCAA, in the NJCAA, and all divisions of the NCAA, they all charge based on playing 1 minute or 1 second of one contest, one pitch, etc. So it's important to understand that when it comes to seasons of competition. Mentioned earlier, one of the forms that needs to be completed is the certificate of clearance. It's a very simple form. You identify all the students that are on the team, and then they sign this form. It's basically a FERPA form, allowing you and us to look at the student's academic information to determine their eligibility. This form is completed by you and kept on file at your institution. It is not sent into our office. This next slide or next two slides are related to Division I only. In Division I, entering freshmen must have a 2.3 GPA from their high school transcripts. If they are, then they're eligible, and they must be listed on the freshman eligibility certificate. If they are between 2.0 and 2.29, they may also meet freshman eligibility requirements by getting a test score on the ACT or SAT that's listed, 18 or 970, and have an overall GPA of 2.0, which we mentioned, or a class rank of 50%. So they'd have to have 2 of those 3 items. If they are below 2.0, they are going to be ineligible for 1 year. There is some exceptions to these rules. So if someone has a 2.0, but not a class rank or a test score, they could get an exception by taking 9 hours in the summer before their first term, or 12 hours in the first term would make them eligible in the second term. And they would have to have a C average in those hours for that exception to work. A lot more details in the handbook, but that's a brief summary of the freshman eligibility requirement. Next slide shows the form that needs to be completed and all the necessary information that's required there. The guiding principles of eligibility there's 4 guiding principles. A student athlete must meet all 4 of these to be eligible. Sometimes people assume that if meet 1 or 2, they're okay, but they must meet all 4. They must be enrolled in 12 hours. They must pass 24 hours in the previous 2 terms. They must have a GPA of 2.0 after junior status. And for every season that they're charged, the progress rule requires them to have passed 24 hours and have a GPA of 2.0. We're going to talk about each of these. So first of all is being enrolled in 12 hours. We talked about this earlier, that a student must be enrolled in 12 hours to be eligible. It does discuss here that they must be in at least 9 hours at your institution and a total of 12 overall. So it's a small exception that allows a student athlete to be enrolled at 9 hours at your school while taking 3 hours at another institution or online to be eligible. Still 12 hours total in a particular term. The 24-hour rule requires a student to pass 24 hours in their previous 2 terms. What some people confuse here is they count the 2 previous terms of the institution. So for example, if it's spring now, the previous 2 terms will be the fall and the previous spring for the institution. But sometimes students take a term off or may only be enrolled in part-time hours. So it's critical in applying this rule is that we're looking at the student's 2 previous full-time terms by looking at their transcript. And in those 2 terms, they must have accumulated a total of 24 hours. A student may also take hours in the summer, and summer hours are added to the previous term. Usually that's the spring term, but it could be the fall term if they were not enrolled in the spring term. Sometimes a student takes hours in what's called the interterm between the fall and the spring. Those hours are then added to the fall term. So if someone is short hours in either the fall or the spring, that's the method they could go through to get to 24 hours. There are some exceptions to the 24-hour rule. Listed here is that if someone has never played before a sport of any kind in college, they can be eligible without meeting the 24-hour rule, but they have to have met freshman rules and have a GPA of 2.0 previously. There's also repeat courses are allowed, 1 per term. If they've either got a D or an F in that course and they repeat it, that course can count toward the 12-hour rule, but only 1 per term. Next eligibility rule is the GPA rule. And there's 2 parts to the GPA rule. The first one here is once someone gets to junior status, they must have a 2.0. Junior status is determined by either getting to 60 hours or whatever your institution defines as junior status, or have completed 2 seasons of competition. Thereafter, you must maintain the 2.0 GPA. Second part of the GPA rule is combined with the progress rule. The progress rule says that for every season that you're charged, you must pass 24 hours. So after I've completed the freshman year and I've been charged the season, I must pass 24 hours. You can see at the bottom of this slide, the additional part of the GPA rule is that I must also then have a 2.0 GPA because I've been charged 1 season. That's part of the progress rule. To participate in my 3rd season, I must have passed 48 hours and have a GPA of 2.0. So sometimes someone may not have got to junior status, but if they've been charged a season, they must have a 2.0 GPA. The progress rule continues. For me to be eligible to play in my 4th season, I must have passed 72 hours. And these are hours that count toward a degree. They can't be random hours. They must be part of seeking a degree program. Those are the main 4 eligibility rules. The next thing we're going to look at is the transfer student. Transfer students create numerous problems when they transfer in because there's a lot of different evaluations that must go on. When a student transfers from another institution and identifies with your institution, you must complete the transfer eligibility statement. Every transfer, whether they've competed or not, must complete the transfer eligibility statement. A transfer may also have to complete a transfer verification form if they competed at the previous institution in the previous season. So if I was at another school last school year and I transferred this school year to your school, then I would need a transfer verification from that previous institution. They must fill it out on the student's behalf. If I went to an institution last year and didn't play and transfer, I do not need a transfer verification. If I played 2 years ago at an institution, then took a year off and then transfer, I do not need a transfer verification. Only when I've competed at the previous institution in the previous season. Once a student has completed these forms, attended your institution for a complete term, they are no longer considered a transfer. They are now your student. 2 other things that are important for transfers here listed is that if a student has been dismissed, expelled, or suspended at their previous institution, they are not eligible until they meet whatever the dismissal or suspension required from the previous institution. There's a lot of details there, which would need to be reviewed probably with myself, the eligibility coordinator, and the handbook has more details about that. The last thing on this slide is about a release. A lot of students ask about getting a release. The NCCA does not require a release from your previous institution to be eligible, and any student leaving the NCCA and going to another institution is automatically free to do so. On the screen now is the transfer eligibility statement. There are a number of questions on the front here that are important. When completing this, it's very important to make sure all of the boxes under the attendance section and under the competition section are completed clearly to be able to evaluate the student's transfer situation. This is the back of the form where you answer some questions that are relevant to the student. And the next slide is the transfer verification. As I said, this is a form that you start and you send to the previous institution, and either the athletic director or the compliance person or assistant athletic director or the FAR at the previous institution should complete this form on behalf of the student and either send it to you and forward it to the eligibility coordinator or send it via the TeamWorks process that would end up in the eligibility coordinator's box. The next slide deals with the transfer student issues. The transfer must have a 2.0 from all their previous transcripts as they transfer to your institution. It's very important that you collect all official transcripts from all previous institutions to determine if they met this 2.0 rule. It's also important to count number of terms of attendance. A student is only allowed 10 terms of attendance to play 4 years of competition. Another thing that happens often in students today is they withdraw from courses. If a W shows up on their transcript, that counts toward the total of 12 hours to determine if that is a term. So it's very important in calculating terms of attendance to look at withdrawn courses. The other issue for transfer students is the progress rule. Many times they may complete, say, the correct number of hours at the previous institution that would allow them to become eligible. But when they transfer, this new institution doesn't accept all of their hours. And this creates problems for progress rule. So it's very important in having transfers come in that you review all this information initially before they enroll at your institution to know whether they'll be eligible or not. It's problematic when a student is learning this information after already enrolled in their institution, your institution, and then maybe not eligible because of the hours being accepted. So make sure that's something you work through. The last thing listed on this slide deals with gap years. And there's new legislation that'll require new information moving forward from this year on, identifying information called gap years. A gap year is when someone is enrolled either in high school, doesn't go to college, and then begins enrollment in college, or they graduate from high school, go to college for a year, take a year or two or more off, and then re-enroll in a college institution. Anytime there's a gap in attendance, that creates a potential problem, and it's important to know what has happened in that gap. Sometimes students do not always reveal where they've attended, so it's important that you collect all this information to know where they've been. When in doubt, do a financial aid audit. Now our last slide is some special situations. Again, we're only hitting a summary on these things. The handbook has much more information. A student who graduates may have eligibility, and if they pursue a second degree or a graduate degree, they may complete their eligibility while a graduate student. A student who graduates from a previous institution and wants to transfer to you may also be eligible to play pursuing a graduate degree or a second undergrad degree, but in both cases, they must be within the 10-term limit. There is a military exception for anyone who's been in the military. If that interrupts their attendance in school, there's a waiver that allows them to be able to compete even if they haven't met the 24-hour rule or the progress rule. Again, the details are in the handbook. There are situations where a student won't be eligible, but there may be extenuating circumstances as a death in the family or a serious injury or illness or other mental health issues or such. And we have a process called a request for an exception to a standard rule. There's a form in the handbook that talks about how to go about that. And then that request is sent to the eligibility coordinator, who works with the eligibility committee to review it to determine if an exception is granted or not. As we mentioned earlier, withdrawing from classes in the middle of a term are problematic and usually affects the eligibility of a student athlete. Mentioned earlier as well, it's important that you get all official transcripts from any previous institution, whether it be high school or college, before a student can become eligible. The interterm we mentioned earlier is the time between December and January. It's considered a non-term, and they can use those hours toward their fall term to be eligible. Also have listed here what's called floating terms or online courses. So some institutions have 5-week courses or online courses that kind of float around and so forth. A student may take those as long as they're taken within the time frame of a traditional term. So if the fall term starts August 31, ends December 10, any course, whether it's online or in one of these floating terms, taken within that time frame, can be applied toward their 12 hours. And the last thing here is that there is a new rule that if an eligibility certificate is completed incorrectly or there's an eligibility violation, it's potential that the head coach could serve a penalty by signing that form and not knowing about the information. A lot more details again in the handbook on that, but it's important that a head coach is aware of what he's doing when he's signing the eligibility certificate. That is the completion of our PowerPoint and our video. Again, this is a summary of key things. We hope it helps you. And when you have questions, you can ask your athletic director or your compliance person. Questions can also come to the eligibility coordinator. It's important also to make sure you read the handbook on the eligibility section. We wish you all the best in this process.